Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to AJC at the Conventions 2020, AJC's virtual advocacy programming on the sidelines of the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. We are delighted to be joined today by Eli Kohanim, U.S. Assistant Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, and Matt McInnes, Deputy Director of the Iran Action Group, both from the United States Department of State. Our esteemed guests are here to discuss the future of U.S. policy toward Iran, negotiation prospects, and the ongoing threats to peace. Moderating today's conversation will be Jason Isaacson, AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. After we hear from Jason and our guests, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Please be advised that AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization. As such, AJC does not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. And as a reminder, this week's programs on the sidelines of the Republican National Convention are identical to those we featured last week during the Democratic National Convention. And with that, Jason, you have the floor.
Bill, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining. This discussion today is on U.S. policy toward Iran, how that policy has been reshaped under President Trump, and how it might continue to evolve in a second Trump term. We also want to look in the course of this hour at the nature of the Iranian threat to the United States and to our Middle East allies and to world peace, and how that threat has been affected by U.S. policy, and also at the threat that the Iranian regime poses to its own people, including its Jewish community, which has roots in the country dating back to more than a millennium before the advent of Islam. I want to state at the outset that AJC, while, as Bill said, is rigorously nonpartisan, we're not neutral on matters relating to Iran policy. We have long advocated decisive U.S. action to confront the Iranian regime's regional aggression and its military nuclear ambitions, as we have supported coordination with like-minded nations in seeking to counter these threats to peace. It is why AJC, after careful consideration, opposed the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, believing it failed sufficiently and enduringly to block Iran's capacity to jeopardize regional peace. And it is why, after what we viewed as a flawed deal was put in place, we urged the United States to work with European allies to build on the JCPOA toward a better, more comprehensive deal, as Mr. McInnes's office sought to do in the months leading up to the US withdrawal. We remain disappointed that this coordinated allied approach failed to gain traction. We were scheduled to be joined today by Secretary of State Pompeo's point man on Iran, Brian Hook, the Special Representative for Iran and Senior Policy Advisor, but Mr. Hook was asked to accompany the Secretary on this week's trip to the Middle East, and we're very pleased that the Deputy Director of State's Iran Action Group, Matt McInnes, who has an extensive background himself in Middle East security issues and on Iran specifically, is able to join us. And we're also pleased, of course, to be joined by Eli Kohanim, the U.S. Deputy Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism. I'll pose a series of questions to our guests, and then we'll take questions from you, our viewers. Now, let me begin by thanking you, Mr. McInnes and Ms. Kohanim, for taking part in this important discussion with AJC.
Thank you very much for having us. This is quite an honor, and really appreciate the work that AJC does.
Thank you, Jason. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here with AJC. And I have to share with the audience that I'm actually a former member of the board of AJC's New York region. I know the incredible work that AJC does. You are indeed the Jewish People's Diplomatic Corps. And so I have to say kudos on everything that you do. And it's really my pleasure to join you here for the first time since I've joined the State Department.
Thank you so much, Eli and Matt. Well, let's begin. I'd like to pose my first question, and then we'll run through a series, and then we'll open it up. This is to you, Matt. President Trump said 2 weeks ago that if he is reelected, he'll make a deal with Iran within 30 days. They're dying to make a deal, the president said in the course of the White House announcement on the historic Israel-United Arab Emirates agreement. if the president does win a second term, Matt, how would you expect that Iran negotiating process to go forward? Are the Iranians that close to the breaking point after almost 2 years of increasingly tough US sanctions and several years of low oil prices?
Thank you. I believe that the president certainly sees the Iran as under very severe pressure right now. Our maximum pressure campaign has been wildly successful, certainly from our perspective, in being able to bring enormous economic pain onto the regime itself. All, of course, while we're continuing to ensure that humanitarian and other goods get to the Iranian people. I think the president is looking at what we're all seeing in Iran right now, which is the regime is struggling to make economic decisions. It realizes it's going to be very difficult to continue on under the current pressure. Plus, frankly, the addition of the COVID pandemic has added enormous complications to the regime's ability to manage multiple crises that are happening. So I think for our perspective, the president sees it, the secretary sees it, that the regime is going to want to talk. And I think they are, of course, looking at our political clock very closely. They are looking to see what will happen in November. And I think that they recognize, I think the president recognizes as well, that the Iranians are going to have to come to the table if there is a second term. And I think that the president in particular sees the opportunities to be potentially ripe for that. At the same time, he's been very clear that he's not just simply going to make any kind of deal with Iran. I think he wants to ensure that we are meeting our objectives of ensuring that Iran never pursues a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program, that it ends its malign activities in the region, that it ceases its destabilizing missile program and proliferation, all the areas that were not addressed fully in the JCPOA that needed to be fixed, that he came in wanting to fix, and we are glad that we tried, but we pulled out in the end when we could not find a way forward on the JCPOA. But I think the president is still very eager to find a new solution on either some type of new deal or long-term pressure on Iran until it is ready to change its core behavior.
But what you're talking about, I think, if I understand correctly, Matt, is a deal, a more comprehensive deal, a longer-term deal, a deal that deals with the other issues that were not addressed in the JCPOA, the regional activities, the missile program, et cetera. This is a revolutionary regime. Do you have any confidence that it will so fundamentally give up on all of these tools that it has used to assert its authority in the region?
You bring up a very good point. And when we were constructing the original 12 points that the secretary presented back in May of 2018 after we left the deal, we recognized that what we were asking for is, one, frankly, what anyone should ask for from Iran, changing its support to terrorism, changing its pursuit of a potential nuclear weapon, its other destabilizing activities, its unlawful detention of US and other citizens from around the world, all the things that Iran does that are unacceptable to us. And I think that we recognized that if we're going to get any type of serious deal that, frankly, the American people could support, that Congress could support, that our allies in the region could support, it needed to be far more reaching than what the previous administration had tried to achieve with the JCPOA. And it does represent, from my perspective, a fundamental change in how the regime has conducted its foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. It's a very tall order, to be very honest. At the same time, we should be expecting nothing less. And that, if we are going to have any type of long-term revived or renewed way to operate with Iran in the region, it has to be on a different framework. It has to be on a different premise in our foreign policy relations and Iran's relations to its neighbors and to our partners and allies in the region. So you're exactly right. We're asking for a lot, but I don't see how else we could ask for anything less.
Billy, let me turn to you. Your family left Iran many years ago, but of course there's still a sizable community there. The Jewish communities of Iran and Turkey, both with deep historical roots, are fractions of their former selves, but are today the largest in the Muslim world, which was once home, of course, to many hundreds of thousands of Jews. How are Iran's Jews regarded and treated by the regime in Tehran, and how does the regime treat minorities in general?
Jason, thank you for the question. So just to share a little bit, I was born in Iran myself, and my father had been accused of being a Zionist spy by someone he had done business with and was told that he would be reported to the authorities. Now, this was at a time when the Islamic Revolutionary Forces decided to execute the president of the Jewish community, Habib el-Ghannaian. And so my family, along with the majority of the Jewish community, which at the time numbered 100,000 Jews, decided that these were all credible threats to us, this rising anti-Semitism at the time, and we fled. So that was a community of 100,000. Today, it's less than 25,000. The estimates are somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Jews left in Iran. What I would tell you, Jason, is first of all, I think the fact that the community has left, a community that you referenced was so ancient, we went back to the first temple period of the Bible. The very fact that we all had to flee speaks volumes about our threat perception and feeling that after thousands of years, it was time for us to leave, unfortunately, our ancient homeland. In terms of the Jews who remain in Iran, I would tell you that there is this kind of Western naivete in terms of understanding the Jews in Iran, so that the regime from the very founding, while espousing anti-Semitism and having this obsessive kind of daily calling for death to Israel and so on, at the same time, what they've loved to do is trot out the Jewish community so that they can spread this propagandist lie, which is, we don't have anything against Jews, it's just a Zionist entity which we hate and want to wipe off the face of the earth. So this is pure propaganda from the regime. And Jason, what you'll note is that it's the same anti-Semitism, which hides under the guise of anti-Zionism, which we find propagated by the Iranian regime and also plaguing Jews all throughout the West in our universities, the same kind of lie. So the bottom line is that, we don't buy this propaganda from the regime. We see their anti-Semitism for what it is.
And in terms of treatment of minorities generally as well, Ellie?
So I would tell you that that the regime's human rights record is one of the most horrendous in the world. Secretary of State Pompeo has called it out numerous times. In fact, most recently, there were some political oppositionists who were arrested in the most recent street protests. And President Trump tweeted in their support in Farsi, and actually the regime decided to hold off on their execution. In terms of religious minorities, I would tell you that the regime routinely bars religious minorities from practicing their religion freely. And they have the most deplorable human rights records against the Baha'is and other religious minorities in Iran. So for example, if a Muslim should want to convert to Christianity, it's considered a reason for them to actually be persecuted, jailed, and possibly murdered for that act.
I should tell you that HAC and our Jacob Laston Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights have been active in support of minority rights against the discrimination that the persecution that they've suffered at the hands of the regime. Matt, let me go back to you on the maximum pressure campaign that you referenced. The campaign was not promoted as intending to prompt regime change through economic collapse and popular discontent, but many observers did see that as the ultimate objective. Is regime change a viable policy option for the United States? What would we expect to come next in that case? Well, oh no, I'm sorry, what would we expect to come next if there is a regime change, is what I mean.
I take the first part of that. I think the president has been clear and the secretary has been clear that we are not pursuing a regime change policy. Is something that is important, especially from the president's perspective, that he still, as focused as we are on Iran, he certainly does not want to pursue policies that would further entrench the U.S. military in the region. So I think that he's always being very judicious about those types of commitments, and certainly pursuing a full regime change policy would entail, a very significant military component in addition to our diplomatic and our economic efforts. So I think we've been clear on that. At the same time, as I was mentioning before, we are talking about very significant changes in the regime's foreign policy if we are going to have any type of way forward between the US and Iran. So I think we are, the maximum pressure effort to get the Iranians to the table to negotiate. This is about bringing as much, stress onto the leadership as possible, because history has shown that you don't bring this particular regime to the table without enormous amounts of pressure. And that needs to be on all fronts, frankly, on the diplomatic, on the economic, information and communications, as well as ensuring there's sufficient deterrence and military pressure to push back against IRGC's destabilizing and provocative activities. So you have to have all of that to really bring Iran to the table. And it's something that, the reason why we have done, frankly, far more under maximum pressure, particularly on the economic front, than any previous administration. I'd like to say that we're the first administration to really take the strategic offensive against Iran, that we are not simply reacting to what Iran is doing, that we are actually trying to change the situation there, in the region and against Iran itself. And this is something that, of course, is something of a high-risk game. And we are taking it further than any other administration has before. At the same time, we're very cognizant that we want to keep, we're not interested in war. We're not interested in military conflict. This is about, pushing Iran to change its behavior. And I think it's something that our maximum pressure campaign has shown it can really have tremendous impact on Iran, at least the Iranian regime. But there's still, obviously, we have a ways to go before the regime seems to be ready to come to the table on the terms that we're looking for. So hopefully we will be seeing that in sometime in the future.
Matt, let me stay with you. The UN arms embargo against Iran is set to expire in mid-October. And the week before last, the United States moved to have the United Nations Security Council extended. There was stiff opposition. Only one other Security Council member state, the Dominican Republic, stood with the United States. Secretary Pompeo notified the UN last Thursday that our country will now invoke the snapback feature of the JCPOA to force a veto-proof extension of the arms embargo, even though the president withdrew the United States from the agreement in 2018. The US position has gained little support, as you know, in the Security Council, even among our longtime allies, Britain, France, and Germany. Can America go it alone in this matter? Can you envision a path forward in which our allies, who surely agree that Iran should not be sending weapons to terrorists or receiving sophisticated arms from China or Russia, can join the United States in extending the embargo? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, we were disappointed that the Council was not able to find a way to extend the embargo. And we can get into the debates about snapback legalities, but I think the most important policy issue was the embargo itself. In that I think it was very clear in reports from the UN itself, its panel of experts in Yemen and elsewhere, that Iran was continuing to violate UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and proliferating weapons to Houthis, to Hezbollah, to the Shia militia groups in Iraq. I think the evidence was incontrovertible at that point in time. And so for us, the idea that you would have an embargo that had been on Iran in some form since at least 2007, to remove that in this environment was just frankly crazy, in my opinion. And I think it's really from the president and the secretary's perspective. And so we were really disappointed that the other members of the Security Council were not able to work with us to find a way to extend it. At the same time, this is something that is extremely important to us, that preventing Iran acquiring new weapons, new advanced weapons from countries like Russia and China, proliferating those weapons to proxy groups or selling them to other states in the region, which would be allowed if the embargo expired, at least by the UN. These are all things that are just totally unacceptable to us. So I think this is the reason why we communicated both our commitment to extending the embargo and the reality that we will snap back all of the sanctions if we were unable to find a solution on the embargo question. So I think this is something that, we recognize that there are a lot of different political opinions about what we did in the council last week. I think we are very confident on the legal defense of what we did. I think, even, if you look back at the statements from former Secretary Kerry or former President Obama, that the U.S. will have an absolute right to be able to trigger snapback unilaterally, even if the rest of the council opposes that. I think we feel very confident from a legal standpoint that we can move forward on snapback, but we recognize this is a lot of politics, and politically there's a lot of pressure from the Russians and others to push back against what we're doing, and we recognize this is ultimately going to have to be a negotiation among our allies and other members of the UN Security Council to find a way forward, or else in less than 30 days now we will have the rest of the previous 5 UN Security Council resolutions that put restrictions on Iran for its nuclear weapons, for its nuclear program, that those will come back. And I think that this is something that's going to force each of the members of the Security Council to face some very hard questions about what they're willing to do, what they're willing to stand up for. And we really do hope that everyone makes the right decision here.
Thank you, Matt. Let me turn it back to you, Ellie. It's hard to imagine it now, of course, but under the late Shah of Iran, there was a diplomatic relationship and a commercial relationship, a normal relationship between Iran and the state of Israel. Do you have the sense that there remains any muscle memory in Iran of that roughly 26-year period of Iranian-Israeli friendship, which ended with the 1979 Islamic Revolution? Is enmity toward Israel widespread in Iran at the popular level, or is it just among the regime's elite?
Jason, I would tell you the best answer to that is that in the most recent street protests in Iran, November 2019 protests, there was video going viral because the regime has painted in places the Israeli flag and the American flag, where people must step on these flags in order to get to where they're going. And you see regular Iranians jumping over the Israeli flag. And so this was one video that went viral. So look, I think that the people of Iran are truly the biggest victims of this regime. And they understand that the regime is constantly manipulating information for their own purposes. They understand that the Israelis are their friends. I would tell you that the Israelis have done a great diplomatic effort in terms of trying to communicate directly with the Iranian people, so that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has a Farsi Twitter account. There are many in the Israeli diplomatic force who do tweet in Farsi and try to communicate directly. And so we see a lot of that activity, and also on Iranian social media, you see Iranian people, average Iranians on the street saying things like, we love Israel. Also, I would tell you that recently there were reports that there are Iranians who seek asylum in Israel. So, again, these kinds of facts, I think, speak for themselves, that the people of Iran understand who their oppressors are, and their oppressors are the mullahs. And I'll tell you one thing that President Trump has made clear over and over again is that he, as long as he's president, will never allow this despotic regime to have nuclear weapons. And I think in terms of the Israel question, what's interesting to note is that it was at the Golan, U.S. recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan, where President Trump said, quote, we will not avert our eyes from the dictatorship that chants death to America, death to Israel, and calls for genocide against the Jewish people. We won't let them even consider that. So that has been President Trump's policy. I think the Iranian people have heard him loud and clear. They've heard from the Israelis loud and clear. And the people know, again, who their oppressors are, which is the regime in Iran.
Ellie, let me stay with you and ask you another question. You used the word obsession before in talking about the Iranian regime's anti-Semitism, promotion of anti-Semitism. Holocaust denial has been a consistent theme of the Iranian regime, and inversion of the history of Iranians in the 1940s who helped victims and survivors of the Holocaust. How can we understand the current regime's obsession with Holocaust denial and its anti-Semitism in general?
Well, I would tell you, Jason, that the regime's anti-Semitism is just truly part and parcel of the regime's ideology. So you have, even in 1979, Khomeini himself making statements like, quote, "The Jews will never be satisfied with anything less than world domination," quote unquote. So anti-Semitism is part and parcel of the revolutionary ideology, and it kind of motivates every single thing they do. So for example, if you look at even the naming of their special ops military force, the Al-Quds force, well, Al-Quds is the Arabic or the Farsi word for Jerusalem. And so the entire operation of the Al-Quds force is the liberation of Jerusalem from the Jews, right? And that goes on also into their proxy activities. So Hezbollah, which was midwifed by the Al-Quds force, their entire operation is aimed at Israel and killing Jewish and Israeli civilians. Right here, closer to our own home in the United States, we have to note that the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in the Americas was the Amia bombing done by Hezbollah in Argentina, which killed hundreds of people and left many more injured. So again, that's the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in the Americas done by an Iranian proxy force. So their obsessive anti-Semitism, Jason, is that they are kind of motivated by anti-Semitism in every move that they make, and it seems to guide their every decision.
Thank you, Ellie. And of course, you're referencing the activities of Hezbollah, which AJC has been campaigning against as an advocate for full designation by the European Union and various countries of that as a terrorist organization. And this is an effort that we will continue. Back to you, Matt. We talked before about the difficulties of getting our allies to join us in the UN, the impossibility actually of getting them to join us in the UN Security Council the other day. But how essential is European support, that is, in order to check Iran's power? And are there concrete steps that the US can take to present a united front against Iran? Also, in addition to getting European allies to join us in these efforts, could you tell us a little bit about the news reports we've been reading in recent days of Iranian-Chinese agreement on a massive new strategic partnership?
Thanks, Jason. I think the Europeans, in particular, they do still share most of our same concerns about Iran. I think even the Secretary mentioned this, privately, and during our debates on the embargo extension, that, they will say to us in person, yes, we completely agree with you. You need to extend the embargo. But we are facing very difficult political headwinds from them and from the Russians, the Chinese, and others, that because they continue to support the JCPOA. This is our fundamental difference. We have moved on past that. And I think still, though, that the Europeans do recognize Iran's destabilizing role in the region. The threat that it poses is expanding, assassination campaigns we're seeing on European soil that's becoming an increasing challenge for European authorities. These are all things that we have commonality, common cause with our European partners. And so I still am an optimistic person in thinking that we will be able to find ways to work with our European partners, despite our differences right now, to address the Iranian problem. And I think our in-state that we see with Iran the Europeans is fairly similar on most of these fronts. So there are opportunities. I think that we can take some strong steps together on the terrorism front, on ways of also looking at how we can prevent further proliferation to non-state actors and proxy groups. These are areas where I think there's, even with the embargo issues, there's common cause with our European partners on those topics in particular. I would say on the China issue, it's been very interesting watching how this plays out in the Iranian political sphere, because it was clear that once that deal, or the deal that's being negotiated, was leaked, there's very strong reaction inside the country against it. This goes to Iranian sensitivities to major world powers engaging in treaties that look like they're ceding or conceding to world powers. This is something from the early 20th century and on, sensitivity about Russia, sensitivity about the UK, sensitivity about even the US's role in the region, that the Iranians are very concerned about ceding their sovereignty, which I think certainly our president can sympathize with, that we do not want to lose our sovereignty. And the Iranians don't want to lose their sovereignty either. And so I think this is something that's going to be very difficult for the regime to manage from an optics standpoint, from a political standpoint, that working with China is ultimately going to make Iran subservient to China. And I don't think the Iranian people want that. And for those that have also been engaging with China's, Belt and Road Initiative over the years, and other, the predatory aspect that China takes in these countries in Asia and Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, I don't think the Iranian people have seen that, and they don't want that. They don't want to be beholden to China. So I think it's going to be very interesting how this plays out over the coming months and years. I think, again, it goes back to the fact that the Iranian people want the regime to take a different path, a different direction in their engagement with the rest of the world, and how they take care of their people at home, both of which the regime has failed miserably.
Thank you, Matt. I think at this point, let's open it up to our viewers. Belle?
Thank you, Jason. Our first question comes from Neil Goldenberg in Bethesda, who asks, did the nuclear deal hurt efforts toward nonproliferation agreements by implicitly legitimizing Iran's intent to have a nuclear weapon in general, albeit sometime in the future? Wouldn't Saudi Arabia and other countries be arguably justified in wanting the same deal? Matt, perhaps to you.
Thanks. This was actually one of our main concerns about the original concession in the JCPOA. Back in really the beginning of the JPOA negotiations in 2013, that the right to enrich was conceded early on. And it's something that we think, and agree with the questioner, set us up for further problems in the region from a proliferation standpoint. I think keeping that objective of zero enrichment throughout the region is something that I'm hoping we can continue to push. It's one of the reasons why snapback becomes a very powerful tool for us, because this brings us back to where we should be, where there should be no enrichment in Iran's nuclear program. And I think this will help us as we set the path on our nonproliferation policy with other countries in the region. And I'm hoping that our next steps in our Iran policy will help reinforce these types of standards that we should be keeping across the board.
In fact, the 123 agreement with the Emirates was predicated in large part on the lack of enrichment.
Absolutely right.
That was very important to us as well. Belle, next question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jeff Rosenstein in Los Angeles, who writes, Ellie, as the administration pursues more policy pushes in the Gulf and the Middle East more broadly, can you discuss how anti-Semitism factors into this equation? Aside from the Israel piece, how does the U.S. work to combat anti-Semitism in the Middle East, and what more can be done?
That's a great question. So, the anti-Semitism in the Middle East is unfortunately systemic, institutionalized anti-Semitism. So we find materials in textbooks and educational material that have unfortunately a ton of anti-Semitic, classic anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes about Jews. We find that there are anti-Semitic sermons made in certain mosques. And then there's certain anti-Semitic materials in the media in Middle Eastern countries. So those are all issues that we deal with in bilateral discussions all the time. And I would tell you that the good news in the region is that because of President Trump's vision for peace, because of the newly announced peace deal that President Trump brokered between Israel and the UAE, the region is now just, had this fundamental shift. And so what you see is that basically you're either on the side of peace or in essence, you're on the side of the terrorists. And so all of this movement for peace that our president has gained momentum and moved forward has also helped in combating anti-Semitism. Those things all go hand in hand, so that people who are open to making peace with Israel, with recognizing that Israel is here to stay, are also understanding that they cannot at the same time allow anti-Semitism to flourish in their societies. And so there's tremendous progress being made there.
Oh, thank you. Belle, next question.
Thank you. Sarah Friedreich in New York says, Matt, you spoke about how the Europeans aren't far from us in their aims regarding Iran. Is our divide a political one? Even if we share the same goals, are they resistant to US leadership? Are they still reeling from US withdrawal from the JCPOA, or is it more than that?
Thank you. The Europeans have a very strong political and at times, I don't want to say personal attachment, but sometimes you have many of the same people that were negotiating the agreement still have senior roles in each of the capitals of the E3 in London, Paris, and Berlin. So there's a lot of personal investment, frankly, from their diplomatic corps in these agreements. And so the resistance to simply throwing out the JCPOA or making dramatic changes to it, on a certain perspective you understand, but from looking from how we see it, these things have to be addressed in some way. And I think that, the Europeans maybe think, in 5 years or so, we can address the flaws once certain sunset clauses come into play. Our administration did not see it like that we have to address these issues now as opposed to waiting till later. And I think that ultimately the Europeans do see most of our goals in the same way. It's just that the attachment to the JCPOA itself has been a huge challenge for us to get past. So I'm hoping, as we move forward, that the process of snapback and other steps that we're taking right now will help set a better framework for us to move forward on a new framework, a new agreement, or a new long-term policy towards Iran that both us and our European as well as our regional partners can support.
Thank you. Bill?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Betsy Warrenkine in Cincinnati, who writes, Ellie, you spoke about the Amia bombing carried out by Hezbollah in 1994, and AJC has been working to encourage European allies in the EU to condemn Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And for our viewers who don't know, right now the EU only labels Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization. Ellie and Matt, perhaps both of you, what more can be done to address Hezbollah's terrorist activity, and what steps are being taken by the Trump administration to lessen Hezbollah's impact in the region?
Matt, so I'll just real quick say that, first of all, this administration has acknowledged that Iran, which is Hezbollah's sponsor, is the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism. So, it's a hallmark of our anti-Semitism policies, countering the Iranian threat and their proxy threat. And it's not just Hezbollah, it's also the Houthis in Yemen and Iran's activity in Syria. So this is, we have been the toughest administration on the Iranian threat, including the maximum pressure campaign, which is the strongest sanctions regime ever in the history of the world against any one country. In terms of countering Hezbollah, so again, that has been the Trump administration's efforts to work with all countries, whether in Europe or in Latin America, to ask every country to indeed designate Hezbollah for what it is, which is a terrorist organization. Matt, I don't know if you have further comment.
Ellie, you hit most of my points. I, again, appreciate AJC's role in helping with this campaign to get more countries, and including hopefully eventually the EU and others, to recognize that Hezbollah, the farce of a political and military wing, that Hezbollah is Hezbollah, and that we need to designate and recognize the organization as a terrorist organization. And it's something that we've been very proud in the last few years to be able to have more countries to do that, Germany being one of the more recent ones. This is something that's important for the rest of the world to come to terms with what Hezbollah has done, and frankly what Hezbollah is doing to the Lebanese people as well. And you look at the enormous challenge that they are facing right now, and Hezbollah is not helping with that in any way, shape, or form. And it's something for us, we are looking at any way that we can interrupt Hezbollah's finances. We've been able to take away, probably close to 60–70% of the financing that they were getting from Iran. This is something that has been a very potent aspect of our policy to go after the finances, to push back against Hezbollah's activities in the region, and to build greater international coalitions against Hezbollah and recognizing for what it is.
Actually, let me jump in. Matt, you raised the issue of Lebanon. We had an AJC Advocacy Anywhere webinar just last Friday on what's happening in Lebanon with the former Ambassador Ryan Crocker and an Al Arabiya correspondent, Pierre Hanum. How does the recent tragedy in Lebanon play into regional perceptions of Hezbollah? Is it possible that we will have even more support politically from the Gulf Arab states, for instance, in urging European countries to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization? Does the continued existence of Hezbollah with its hands on the throat of Lebanon change the possibility of the aid that Lebanon so desperately needs to rebuild from this tragedy?
Yeah, well, I certainly see the current crisis and tragic crisis that Lebanon is in right now, is exposing to more, we've always kind of known this, but it's exposing to more countries around the world about the role Hezbollah, the negative role and the nefarious role that Hezbollah has been playing in Lebanese politics, Lebanese security and society for a very long time. And so I think you're exactly right that as the world looks to help Lebanon work through the current situation, I think it's going to become very clear that Hezbollah is an obstacle to moving forward as opposed to in any way, shape, or form part of the solution. So I certainly know that the Gulf states and others in the region have been reevaluating their role and in Lebanon vis-a-vis Hezbollah and the role that Hezbollah has been playing. I think that's been a very powerful process to help a reckoning, frankly, for Lebanese politics to see what Hezbollah represents and what Hezbollah is doing to them. And so I certainly see out of this enormous tragedy the opportunity for the region and for Europe and for the rest of the world to take a different approach and put the pressure where it really needs to be, which is against Hezbollah and other corrupt and nefarious elements inside the Lebanese system.
And also the necessity of disarming Hezbollah as this alternative army within Lebanon, which threatens the Lebanese people, but also threatens their neighbor Israel. Bill, next question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from David Chaffetz, an AJC leader in Sarasota, who writes, the government of Iran, as mentioned, has spoken out against the UAE-Israeli peace deal. Has there been any objective response from the Iranian population about the treaty with Israel? And to combine with another question, is there future concern about populations of the regions and countries that might pursue agreements with Israel and how they will respond to those developments?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. We've certainly seen the Iranian regime has been very negative, as you would expect, about the peace agreement between Israel and the Emirates. So what, in some ways it's a sign we've done something very good, given the degree of regime anger at what's happening, because they recognize this undermines so much of what their messaging and what their ideology has been over the past 40 years, which is to negate Israel, to destroy Israel, to work to build coalitions against Israel. This is something that is fundamentally a threat to their own system and their own beliefs, at least within the regime. And so what you see from the Iranian people, it's sometimes difficult for the Iranian people to be heard through the loudness of the regime on this issue. But I do think that the Iranian people in particular want to see a more peaceful situation in the country, in the region. This is something that I think they support a kind of a de-escalation with tensions with adversaries and coming to a new type of modus vivendi with the rest of the region. I think that's been a long time goal for most Iranians. They don't necessarily, and most don't share the same kind of extreme ideology that the regime has. So I think this particular move with the UAE, and we're hoping there will be further steps coming that the Secretary and Brian and others are working hard on. I think that we'll see additional steps that will help further improve the peace in the region, as well as continue to threaten the Iranian regime's ideological pillars.
Actually, let me jump in and ask both of you, to what extent can news of the outside world that is not filtered through the Iranian regime's propaganda machine reach the Iranian people? Ellie, Matt, what's your sense?
Jason, you know, you're making a very interesting point. I would tell you that it's not even just about news reaching the people of Iran, but it's also about the information flow from Iran out to the rest of the world, and how the Iranian regime makes sure to cut flow within the country, so that in the November 2019 street protests, where millions of Iranians took to the streets to protest the regime's oppression, for 7 days, the regime cut off their internet access. I mean, can you imagine a country not functioning for 7 days without internet? You know, and it was a blow to their economy to do that. But it would seem that they decided to do that because they knew that their very existence potentially was at threat with the level of discontent that the Iranian people were expressing. And so that's one of the tactics that they've taken in terms of trying to keep control of the population of Iran. At the same time, the regime uses Twitter and social media to try to get their own hatred and violent messaging out to the world. And so we've seen, for example, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei used Twitter to call Israel a cancer. He tweeted out a 14-point plan for eliminating Israel off the face of the earth, to deny the Holocaust, and so on. And so, you know, I would tell you that the Secretary of State and Special Representative Brian Hook have in the past asked American social media companies to consider shutting down Khamenei's Twitter account, given all the hate that he espouses on that platform.
Thank you. Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, just to say that ensuring that the Iranian people can receive news and get their own message out to the rest of the world is one of our highest priorities in our policy. We work diligently every day to help the Iranian people find ways to get past censorship and other restrictions that the regime puts on social media, on other, you know, television, radio, all these things. It's been a long-standing policy for the U.S. To penetrate that wall as much as possible and to help the Iranian people, again, get their message out to the rest of the world.
Thank you. Del?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Josephine Goldsmith in Brussels, who writes, Ellie, you spoke about the Jewish community and the Baha'i community. What other minority groups are in Iran, and would you count the Kurds among them, or are they such a separate entity that they're not seen as an Iranian minority? What is the state of the Kurds in Iran today?
Okay, so I would tell you that there's religious minorities and ethnic minority groups in Iran. So as far as the religious minorities, we spoke about the Jewish community, there's the Christian community, the Baha'is, and then some of the ethnic minorities are the Kurds indeed, and the Arab Ahwazis. And Iran's human rights record against all of its minorities is appalling. It's unacceptable. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said that it's not only unacceptable, but their human rights record is actually evil. And so, you know, we asked the world community to join us in condemning Iran's horrendous human rights record. I would also tell you that the status of women in Iran is deplorable. You know, if you're a woman in Iran, if you're a girl in Iran, well, first of all, your father could behead you in an honor killing, and there's no legal recourse to that. You can be arrested just because you don't want to wear the mandatory hijab, and you can actually be imprisoned for that and and have lashes as part of your sentence. You have second-class citizenship as a female in Iran, and so on. So the regime's human rights records against its religious minorities, its ethnic minorities, its women, and all political opponents is truly appalling. And I would tell you their chief domestic weakness in that the people of Iran are just tired of it.
Thank you, Ellie. Bill?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Kenneth Kaplan, who writes, if current US policy is focused on changing Iran's external behavior, what thought is there in the State Department about Iranian civilian attitudes towards the United States? And are they adversely impacted by the current administration's policies? Perhaps to Matt.
Yeah, Bill, could you repeat that question again?
Absolutely, sorry. Kenneth Kaplan writes, if current US policy is focused on changing Iran's external behavior, what thought is there in the State Department about Iranian civilian attitudes toward the United States? And are they adversely impacted by the current administration's policies?
Yeah, I think for us, we do pay attention as best we can to where the people are and what they're thinking, what they would want to see, what they're hoping from U.S. policy is something that is extremely important to the Secretary. And we spend an enormous amount of time, as I mentioned before, ensuring both we can, the world can see inside Iran and the Iranian people can see outside to the rest of the world and engage. And so that's something that we are very conscious of. We focus our policy very much on the regime, and it's something that all of our sanctions are targeting the IRGC, the clerics, some of the key judges that execute some of the worst human rights abuses, and of course the supreme leader and all the military and security apparatus that really direct their the most diabolical stuff that they do. So we're very keen to make sure that we are pressing the right buttons at the top. And throughout the system that are the parts of the Iranian foreign policy as well as domestic policy that create the most trouble and, as Ellie said, the most evil. So this is something that we're going to continue to be very sensitive to, as we calibrate our policy. But you should have no doubt that we are going to continue to have a very strong maximum pressure campaign that is designed to bring the regime to face with its problems, what it needs to change, and that we need to find a better way for Iran to operate in the region.
Let me jump in for a second. Matt, let me ask you, the January killing by the United States of General Qasem Soleimani, what has been the kind of the military response of Iran, other than the firing missiles into U.S. installations in Iraq? Has it affected the kind of aggression, the kind of policies that Iran has practiced in Syria and elsewhere around the region?
Well, we've seen since the killing of Qasem Soleimani that Iran has restrained a lot of his activities. It hasn't stopped him by any means, and we had a very significant flare-up of hostilities in March in Iraq from some of the Shia militia groups. So you can't say that it stopped all the activity. That's certainly not true. But we do think that the killing of Qasem Soleimani is having a longer-term effect in the regime's ability to organize and execute some of its regional policies underneath the IRGC's direction. So that's certainly one of the after effects that from the killing of Qasem Soleimani back in January. But for us, it was important to ensure that Iran knew that we have red lines. And that the killing of Americans in particular, that the president will respond to that and make that absolutely clear. And I think the Iranians understand that now. And, for right now, we think we are in a relatively good place in deterring Iranian activity right now, but we have to remain very vigilant. Iran is going to continue to test us. And we need to remain firm in the region and in solidarity with our allies and in cooperation with our partners there in the region. So these are all things that are extremely important for us to maintain during this period while we continue the maximum pressure campaign and look for finding a new solution with Iran.
Thank you, Matt. Bill?
Thank you. I think this will be our final question before turning it back to you, Jason. We actually just got a surge of questions asking about, for both of you, how COVID-19 has impacted this entire conversation, both specifically in the Iranian context and Ellie, in your work combating anti-Semitism more broadly. So perhaps you'd both like to speak to those questions.
Ellie, you want to begin?
Sure. So it's actually a great question as it relates to this particular conversation about Iran, because what the Iranians chose to do is they typically host a Holocaust denial cartoon competition. And so now in the latest twist in that, they hosted COVID cartoon competitions, in which, of course, within these cartoon competitions, there were a number of horribly anti-Semitic COVID cartoons that were awarded by the regime. And also the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself tweeted a tweet with the hashtag COVID-48. So now COVID-48 is comparing the coronavirus with the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. So in essence, he was comparing the creation of the Jewish state with the coronavirus, which in theory needs to be eliminated, correct? So they, what the Iranians seem to do is be kind of very creative with their anti-Semitism, keeping up with the news and finding every which way they can to spread their message of hate. And this all while at the same time, we all know that the people in Iran were suffering tremendous numbers from the coronavirus, which came to Iran via Mahan Airlines, direct flights from China to Iran. The regime has lied about their statistics, about how many Iranians have gotten sick. They have failed miserably in helping their own people. And like I said, they've taken the opportunity of this pandemic to try to increase hatred towards the Jews and the State of Israel, which is their want, typically.
Thank you, Ellie. Matt?
Ellie hit on almost all the points I would have said. I would just add that, COVID and the failure of the regime to respond effectively to it has further exposed the serious problems and dysfunction of the government. It's something that the Iranian people are frustrated with. And it's something that we know is compounding the maximum pressure campaign and exposing these problems, as well as putting more challenges to the regime in its decision making, which is the goal of our policy, is to put that kind of pressure where the only path forward for them is negotiations and finding a new way forward with the United States and with the rest of the world. So I think for us, COVID has of course been a worldwide tragedy. It's something that the Iranian people have suffered quite a bit, and for us, it's something that, again, it helps bring into relief what needs to be done for inside that country and for the regime to change its spots.
Matt, thank you very much. And Bill, let me just wrap up rather than going back and forth. To thank Ellie and to thank Matt for being in today's conversation with HAC. Matt, let me also ask you to send our special regards to your boss, Brian Hook, and our regards to your incoming colleague and boss, Elliot Abrams, with whom HAC has worked, of course, for many, many years. Yes. Thank you both for being part of this really important conversation with HAC. Bill?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all for that fascinating conversation. And Ellie and Matt, again, for taking time out of your busy schedules and important work to be with us. To register for upcoming AJC at the Conventions programming, please visit www.ajc.org/conventions. Thank you to our viewers for being with us. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.